Good evening, my friends. This is Paul, and before we begin this video, if there's anyone watching this who has ever emailed me with a game that you wanted me to try out, I do want to thank you for being brave enough to actually send that email, because I know it can be intimidating to email a content creator, especially the more popular ones that don't respond to their emails. So thank you very much. I especially want to thank Luke Vincent, who sent me a free download code for his game Automaton Lung. I didn't end up reviewing it because it wasn't really my type of game, but I'm still abundantly grateful that he just went ahead and said, hey, here's a free game. If you want to review it, you can. I appreciate your sincerity. I honestly loved that gesture so much that I ended up putting it on my best memories list in 2023, I'd like to say. So with the amount of emails that I've gotten of people saying, hey, I would like you to try out this game that I made, I realized that there's a common pattern in every single one of my responses to these emails, and that's, I'm flattered that you sent me a game, but it's not my kind of game. And so I figured that if there are people watching this who are game developers who like my reviews, I'd be very surprised if that's the case, but if there are people out there who like my reviews and want to make games that they want me to review on the channel, I'm just going to make this video posting, here are my guidelines for what constitutes a game that I like. And if you're going to make a game that is catering to my sensibilities, me as an individual, here's what you got to do. Now, I figured that I won't talk a whole lot about major first-party IPs just because I figure every game developer has to start small. And so asking you to be on the level of something like Path of Radiance or Super Mario Galaxy is probably a bit too much to ask at this point. So I will try to limit the games that I directly reference to stuff that's a bit more on the smaller scale or only had a couple of people making them, and point out why those games succeeded in making them approachable to me. And for that matter, that's a good segue into one of my points. And that's, first and foremost, if it's the very first game in what is eventually going to be a series, it has to be approachable. I'm the type of person that I can't handle too much complicated information. I'm a very straightforward, step-by-step individual. I cannot handle stuff that requires a lot of logical leaps or intuition because my brain is going to say, wait a minute, you forgot that instruction right there. At my job, I have a checklist that has a very specific order that I'm supposed to do my tasks in, and admittedly, there's a certain art to knowing when to skip that task if, say, for example, the customers are in the way because I work at a 24-hour gym. But the point still stands that if something is too complicated and requires a whole bunch of explanations just for me to actually play the game, that's going to be a big turnoff. An example of something that is approachable but hard to master, that's not a video game, is chess. Chess is one of the easiest games to learn ever, in my opinion. Once you know the general movement behind how each chess piece works, then you're good to go. But what makes chess brilliant is that it's actually quite complex knowing how to actually win, because not only do you have to master the movement of the pieces, but you have to try to guess what's going on in your opponent's head while not specifically being a mind reader, and there are countless ways that you can do that. You'd have to think, okay, have I faced this opponent before? If so, are they anticipating my moves? In which case, how can I trick this person? What is this person's personality type? If this person's an intuitive type thinking 12 moves ahead, then maybe I need to throw this person off by doing... And there's so much mental stuff going on for my Myers-Briggs audiences that chess is very much an NT thing. I am not, so... Chess is not the kind of game that I enjoy the most, but I would say that it's a good starting point for the general design philosophy that I'd like you aspiring game devs to do, is think, how can we make a game where the system itself is approachable, but yet actually mastering it can take years, if not a person's entire life. Another thing that's important is the game's got to be fun. A lot of people seem to think that if a game is enforcing your values, then that automatically makes it good. And my response to that is, if that were the case, then I'd think Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece. But I don't. I don't actually like Lord of the Rings all that much. I cannot stand the books, and the movies I used to think were pretty good, but as time goes on, I'm starting to think they're just generic war movies. And the whole plot is basically Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows stretched into one Horcrux instead of 7. If you're trying to enforce something that I believe in very strongly, if it sacrifices the fun factor, then I'm not going to like it. To give an example of a game that I like, but in terms of the gameplay I have a hard time getting used to, is Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Now, I said that I wasn't going to try to use a whole lot of AAA games, but this is an example of where the gameplay itself is the problem. So you can say, don't make your games like Xenoblade Chronicles 3. That game has one of the most profound Catholic messages I have ever heard in a video game. It has a very strong pro-life emphasis and talks about the values of family life. It has a very pure and innocent mixed bath scene that has no hints of sexuality whatsoever. It's almost as if we're being back in the Garden of Eden, where nudity is not frowned upon and body positivity is accepted. The problem is that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has a very complicated battle system that was actually so hard that if you watch my review, you'll notice that I had the game on auto battle the whole time, because I was like, I love the story, I love exploring the world, but my goodness, I cannot comprehend this battle system because there's just so much going on and so much to keep track of. Now, if you want to take a smaller scale project of a battle system that's simple to learn but complicated to master, that's a bit more on the indie side, then I would say a good example of an easy to learn, hard to master battle system is Undertale, and for that matter, Deltarune, since Toby Fox confirmed that the later chapters are coming out in 2025. In Undertale, you only have 4 actions, and those actions are at the bottom of the screen at all times. Fight, item, act, and mercy. I think I said the order wrong, but you get the gist of it. And if you have basic reading comprehension, you don't even need me to explain what all of them mean. When you say mercy, you think, oh, okay, I can forgive the enemy. That's a gameplay mechanic. That's cool. Fight, admittedly, is probably the most complex, but once you actually get into a fight, all it is just a basic timing minigame. And even then, the game is so generous that you don't even really have to be good at the fighting minigame, except in very specific instances. For one, it's a Catholic mechanic because the game's selling point is it's a friendly RPG where no one has to die. That premise is so very Catholic, but the game does not sacrifice the fun factor in order to deliver on those morals. If anything, delivering on those morals is what makes the game fun, because actually figuring out how to spare the enemy, because a lot of them aren't going to trust you at first, is part of the fun. Figuring out, okay, I need to get to know this enemy's personality, and then I need to figure out what would appeal to this enemy the most. And I also need to think if maybe my Catholic theology would discourage me from treating the enemy like this. So by using theology as a strategy guide, you're essentially making the game easier for yourself. And in my personal opinion, the true pacifist route is by far the best way to play Undertale. Genocide, in theory, it sounds cool because you have 2 really amazing bosses, but going to those really amazing bosses is a real pain because you have to grind just to get the enemies to appear, and the grind rates actually get longer as the game progresses. So you are forcing players to engage with invisible enemies, but in the pacifist route that's not as much of a problem because you're trying to spare the enemies, and you don't actively have to go out of your way to spare them. As long as you are not killing any enemies, you can still get the true pacifist route just fine. So the game does not force you to grind, and if a battle comes along where the enemy tries to attack you, you don't have to feel like you were forcing the game to get you to that moment. Now, I will say right now that there are a few genres that I just will not play, even if you do have all of these factors of the game being fun, but it also being approachable, but not using values to undermine the game's fun factor. I do not like shooters. The only shooter that I'm even somewhat decent at is Kid Icarus Uprising, but it has been so long since I've played that game that I'm not sure how much I would like it going back, because I don't know, maybe I'm developing early arthritis, but I remember thinking the control scheme was passable back then, but also seeing like, yeah, I could see where a lot of people wouldn't like it after a while, but maybe now that I'm used to the Wii U, maybe my opinions have changed. I still hold the unpopular opinion that the Wii U gamepad is better than the Switch Joy-Con, so let's see if the Switch 2 improves on that. I do not really like sports games that much. Mario sports games are hit or miss for me, but generally speaking, I think the tennis games are the best out of them because they're approachable enough. You run to the ball, you hit the ball, and then you hope that it lands on the right side of the court so that you're not the one getting penalized. It's a pretty easy to understand system because you already know what tennis is like. But then it has enough Mario flair to make the tennis actually more fun by incorporating Mario elements. But again, I broke my own rule of not talking about major IPs, so let's move on. Racing games, generally not a big fan, unless if they're like Cruisin' Blast or Mario Kart. I don't really like massive multiplayer online games all that much. I don't really like online games in general, so if your game has a strong component of online communication, that's going to be a huge turnoff to me. I like games that anyone can play in single player without needing a huge hassle of a setup. So for example, yes, you can play Fall Guys by yourself, but the game requires you to always be online, and then you have to have a lobby full of players, and it's a major hassle. I ended up putting Fall Guys on my worst games of 2020 list as a result, because I was like, yeah, I wish there was a single player mode. I wish there was an adventure mode. So try to make a game that has some kind of sense of single player progression, where you feel like you're accomplishing something, but if you don't have the friends or the internet connection to do it, it's not going to be a big turnoff. I will also mention right away that just in case you couldn't tell by the patterns of the games that I've reviewed, I really only review games for Nintendo systems. That's not that I hate the other systems, it's that I don't see the point in upgrading to them when they already have a bunch of practices that I find either confusing or nonsensical. For example, the other systems just don't have good exclusives. Like, Sony has Ratchet and Clank, but they come out so infrequently, and they're so similar to games that I could play on Nintendo systems that I don't see the point of upgrading to a PlayStation just to play Ratchet and Clank. Similarly, a lot of games that we all used to think would stay exclusives eventually ended up being multi-platform. And as a result, it's possible that some games that I might find passable on the other systems could come to Nintendo systems eventually. Nintendo systems generally have a very approachable design to them. Like, when you open up the Switch's menu, you see all of the games in a bar, and all you have to do is hover over to the right icon, press the A button, and if you have multiple profiles, select the profile. And that's like the extent of the complication. You don't have to sign into your network, you don't have to sort through a bunch of menus. There are some menus, but you don't have to sort through them to actually play the game. That's the problem that I had with the Xbox 360, was I was like, what do I do to even just play the darn game? But now back onto the gameplay side of things. I've talked about genres that I don't like, but what about genres that I do like? I like visual novels to an extent. I don't like visual novels that heavily rely on female sexualization as a way of selling the game. I don't mind there being good-looking women in a game, but as long as it's realistic. Now, I do know that some of you might be thinking, but Paul, Doki Doki Literature Club Plus was your game of the year of 2021. So clearly, games where dating is the focus is something that you like. But here's what I like about Doki Doki, without going into too many spoilers, is that it was made by someone who's trying to make fun of anime. And as someone who also does not like anime, I found that trying to think of it from the standpoint of Dan Salvato not liking anime made the game funnier, because I was like, oh, he's reinforcing these stereotypes that I don't like for the sake of humor. Additionally, in the Plus version, they have all these side stories that take place in an alternate universe where the protagonist doesn't exist, and it presents another side to the girls that makes them feel more developed. And honestly, even though they're girls, they feel so relatable to me, or at least some of them do. Like, obviously they have different personalities, but Yuri was always the character that I could not stand in my Doki Doki playthroughs. She was like, oh, shut up with all of your philosophical meanderings. I don't want to hear any of it. But in the side stories, she became one of my favorites because I could really relate to how hard she struggled to even make basic conversation, and some of the logical leaps that she would make, and how good she was at comforting the other girls. And there was one point where she was breaking down and I felt like I was going to break down, and I don't typically cry too much in games, but in that moment I was like, I feel you, Yuri. Like, I can definitely relate to that. Now, relatability for the sake of relatability is not something that I generally like. I don't want the main character in a game to have long hair just because I have long hair. But what I do want is, if you're going to represent someone, make it a supplement, not the main selling point. I know that there are lots of games on there that'll shoehorn in, for example, a gay plot because they want to appeal to gay players, but that doesn't automatically make the game good. If anything, it feels like it was forced. Whereas if you're going to put something into the game, make it feel natural. Make it feel like it was always meant to be there and it enhanced the narrative, but did not destroy it. So I got a little bit sidetracked, but generally speaking, I like visual novels if there's something fun about the visual novel. So for example, Zero Escape games have a lot of writing, like a ton of writing. In fact, I would say that 80% of the Zero Escape games are just reading. But the Zero Escape games take advantage of the fact that they're visual novels and use it as a supplement to the story. I really don't want to spoil how they do that, because these have some of the most ingenious endings I've ever seen in a video game, and any medium ever for that matter. But one example of that is in Virtue's Last Reward, the second game. You have many different choices that you can make, and mixing and matching those choices will result in approximately 28 some odd endings. But in 999, getting one of those endings would require you to start all the way back at the beginning of the game and redo puzzles you've already solved just to get to another choice, make that different choice, and hope that you could get a different ending. Virtue's Last Reward fixed that by introducing a concept known as the flowchart, where you could easily travel back to a choice that you made and make a different choice. But the game itself is also really fun because the narrative makes an action that would otherwise be boring into something that I ended up liking. So to give you an example, in Virtue's Last Reward, there's a mini game that you play called the A.B. game, where the idea is that you're basically playing through the prisoner's dilemma. You just solved a puzzle room with two different people. One of those people is your ally, who's going to be in the room with you. The other person is going to be in a separate room and is going to be your opponent. And it's your job to decide whether you want to ally with that person or betray that person. And there's 4 different combinations of how it can work out. And depending on those combinations, you either gain, lose, or have a neutral effect on how many points you have. And if you have enough points, then you can escape from the facility that you're trapped in. So you have to think, okay, what is my opponent going to vote? Because the logical choice might not be the right choice, but the right choice might also be beneficial to more people. And so you have to think, how well do I know that opponent? And do I feel like I can trust this person? And also, have I been paying attention to the story where maybe I have to make an outside-the-box answer? And so if you were paying attention to all these pages of dialogue, then a simple gameplay mechanic of choose either ally or betray, such a boring gameplay, becomes engaging because the story makes you think about which option you're going to pick. And I know I just talked about the flowchart and how you can just go back to the A.B. room again and pick the other option if you get the wrong one. But the inherent joy of picking the right choice the first time and feeling underwhelmed if you're a completionist and going back and saying, what would I do if I pick the wrong choice? It's an inherently anti-completionist game by its nature, and that's what makes me love it, because I don't really like games that shame you for not being a completionist. So when the game actually calls you out and said, why would you bother going back to that when you already made the right choice? But also when the game calls you an idiot for making the wrong choice, saying, did you really not pay attention? We just had hours of dialogue trying to establish all these character motivations and you didn't pay attention to a single word of it? I'm the type of person that is very detail oriented. I love looking around at my surroundings. I love paying attention to things that are aesthetically pleasing. I know I don't talk about it much, but I do have a keen eye for beauty. I just don't have a logic behind it like some other types would. If you're going to make a game, make sure that whatever I am paying attention to is not too abstract. Make sure that it's something that the average person can easily grasp just by using simple observation. We'll go back around to Doki Doki Literature Club for this one, because that has a system that is easy to learn, hard to master. There's not too much gameplay in the main game of Doki Doki Literature Club, but the gameplay that it does have is a poetry minigame where you simply select one of the words on the piece of paper and one of the girls at the bottom will jump up and down depending on which word you pick. Now, each girl has a set of words that they really like, and depending on which girl you pick the most key words for, that will trigger that girl's romance route. The problem is that the game does not really tell you this when you're first going through it, and honestly, I think some players might even go an entire playthrough of Doki Doki without even realizing what the poetry game does. But if you actually take the time to pay attention to the girls' personalities throughout the game, even if you fail the first time, just pay attention to like subsequent routes. Like, okay, Sayori talks a lot about death, so maybe I should pick morbid words. Yuri is the philosophical, meandering, nonsensical girl that is not too great in the main story, so pick all of the philosophical, meandering, nonsensical words that make me have a migraine when I just see them. And so by paying attention to the girls in the story, it makes a boring game where you just pick an option more fun, because the reward is more scenes with these girls and more development, admittedly not as much as the side stories, but it's always more fun to see, you know, the different art and to just have a little bit more of a supplement to the game itself. So in that respect, the game is rewarding you for simply observing stuff that the game makes apparently obvious. Like, it doesn't take a genius to realize that Yuri is an intuitive person, and so anything that's abstract and out there is going to appeal to her. So if you make that connection upon first meeting Yuri, then you can say, I'm noticing that there are philosophical and abstract words in this poetry game. So putting two and two together, if I'm the type of person that really likes Yuri and wants to go on the Yuri romance route, then by paying attention to what she likes, that ends up enhancing the gameplay. So I've went on for quite a long time about what games I do and don't like. And because I don't like to script these videos, I probably didn't get around to every single point. So if for some reason you're still left wondering, Paul, I learned nothing from this long video. Just watch my Games of the Year lists, just comb through my reviews and look for which ones do you think I overall had a good impression of. Generally speaking, I like games that are approachable. I like games that involve a lot of exploration where observation is key to the gameplay. I like games that are pleasant to look at, that have a relatively consistent logical system. If the gameplay itself is boring, but by paying attention to the writing that makes it better, that's something that I generally really like. I don't like games that sexualize women. If you're gonna try to appeal to my values, don't make it the central point of the game or make it feel like pandering. Make it feel like a natural part of the gameplay experience. make it on a Nintendo system. That's probably the biggest thing. And don't force, I guess this isn't in terms of actually the game design itself, but in terms of if I'm actually going to review your game, do not pay me to do it. Don't try to force me to adjust my natural thoughts just to make you happy. Because I'm the type of person that I'm going to say it like it is. If I don't like a game, I'm not going to say, well, my friend made it, so I'm going to be a little bit nice. I'm going to say, that stinks. So think for yourself, okay, Paul has made a video that's almost 30 minutes talking about his preferences. Surely I know how to make a game that he likes by now. And think to yourself, is Paul going to say that this game stinks? And again, I've made like 300 some odd reviews, so surely it shouldn't be that hard to figure out what games I like and don't like just by following those patterns and by looking at which games are in my worst games lists, which I don't really like making anymore, but back when I did, you can say, okay, I won't make a game like this. And if you want to know my favorite game, that game would be Tears of the Kingdom. Now, I know that might not be the most obvious in terms of what I mentioned, but Tears of the Kingdom was another entry in a franchise I was already familiar with. So we'll save that discussion for another day. But as game developers, you're obviously going to start out with one game and hope it becomes a franchise. So start out by introducing simple to learn, hard to master systems. And then after that, then maybe you can add more complexity to your games, kind of like how Three Houses introduced a whole bunch of new stuff, making it very hard for newbies to approach, but for veterans, it can give them a fresh perspective. So I hope that gave you guys an adequate understanding of how my brain works and what you should do and what you should not do when it comes to appealing to my sensibilities. If you ever want to send me a code, let me know if somehow I still left out anything. And I hope you guys will enjoy my reviews, especially the more recent ones. I put so much time and effort into them compared to how much I used to, so I hope you will appreciate how far the channel has come. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!